I always later this time of the year and take things on. It might warm up.
Good evening, citizens. It is now 7 o'clock, and we appreciate you all taking the time to be here this evening. Before we start the program tonight, I'd like to introduce the presenters who will be discussing the findings of our recent drainage study. Unless they're going to run in like they do during the TV shows. All right, the important guys. Randall England, who I think a lot of you know, he's our Double Oak Public Works Director. He's the cowboy hat. Scott Rushing is with Hatton Associates, and when Scott gets up here, he's going to give you a little bit of a bio on himself and all of his qualifications. He's been a great help during this process. Chris Logenauer, he's our town administrator. If you have not met Chris, make sure you shake his hand. He's doing an amazing job at the town hall, and we appreciate everything he's doing. We have I think I saw one of our Mayor Pro Tem, Mike Courtney, is in the house tonight, so thank you, Mike, for being here. And here in a little bit, Officer Henderson of our Double Oak Police Department will be coming in. We always think it's important that the Double Oak Police Department is a part of all of our meetings, and in case any of you get rowdy. That hasn't happened yet. I did get threatened to be thrown out of the last meeting, but that's all right. And then, of course, my name is Patrick Johnson. I'm the mayor of Double Oak. So, as many of you know, our town has faced ongoing challenges with flooding and drainage, and this study was conducted to identify long-term solutions to protect our homes, roads, and infrastructure. This evening, we will focus on gathering information and engaging in an open dialogue about the study. We have a map on display for you to view, and we encourage you to engage in further discussions about specific areas of your concern. We do have a hard stop at 9 o'clock because the church has to come in and clean this room out. But we're going to make sure we stop in time, so if you want to come up to the map and ask some questions, it may happen during some of the Q&A as well, so we'll make sure that we have time for that. It is important to note that we are not here tonight to present any immediate solutions. Instead, this meeting is about thoughtful conversation and due diligence to guide the town towards the next steps in improving our drainage system. To ensure we can make the presentation and allow all citizens a chance to be heard, we had a sign-up sheet out there. It doesn't appear as anybody signed up, which isn't a big deal. Everybody's going to be able to speak. But we will limit that to 2 minutes. A lot of our Q&A in the first two sessions really hasn't been 2 minutes. It's really been a lot of questions, and then, of course, we can provide what answers we can. We do that to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in the meetings and to keep it moving forward because we've only got the 2 hours. I'm going to apologize in advance if we get into a long discussion. I may have to call a timeout, and then we can continue that at a later date. The study identified several areas for improvement, such as new detention ponds, storm drain diversions, and updates to town ordinances. These are all critical elements that will help us determine the success of any of these efforts, and you, the residents, can be of great assistance to that. No matter what infrastructure changes we make, our drainage system will only work as intended if each resident takes responsibility for managing water flow on their own property. This means regularly clearing debris from your drainage ditches, ensuring that culverts and under driveways are open and functioning properly, keeping vegetation under control so that the water can move freely. The town may make major improvements to an overall drainage system, but we cannot maintain the ditches and culverts on your property. Your role is vital. Without active participation, even the best infrastructure improvements will fall short. Tonight we will review the study results and discuss how we can move forward together. The key takeaway is that improving our drainage situation will require collective effort. By working together, we can make Double Oak a safer and better protected community. On the table, many of you have them. If you don't, you feel free to come up and take one. We have a handout that you can take with you, and it provides additional insight to our drainage study, both current and past, and some possible solutions to mitigate our issues in the future. please feel free to take one. We ask that if you can, one per household, just because to make sure everybody's got one, but I think we have enough of them this evening. So, at the end of the 4th drainage meeting, we will take all of the documentation, all of the notes that have been collected through all 4 meetings and prior, and they will be posted up on our website, so you'll have full access to these. Up to and including, we are actually recording each drainage session, and we will be uploading the videos as well. So we want to have full transparency to what took place in the 4 meetings, and all this information will be posted on the website. So I appreciate y'all being here, and we look forward to taking the next steps with you. So right before I bring up Scott, I just want to let you know that inside the packet, in 2007, the town did a drainage study on more of a micro level, and there were a few projects that took place out of that, but for the most part, most of it didn't. With this being more of a macro level, the notes that are inside the handouts are comparing what the two are different and what are similar in nature to those. And as we progress with our discussion this evening, I think a lot of your questions may get answered just by the fact that we're having open dialogue. Feel free to raise your hand when it's time to go to Q&A. We're going to try and do the right side and the left side. We're not going to pick on anybody, but we want to make sure that everybody gets heard tonight. And then about probably 8:45 or 10 till, we'll probably end what we've got going on. So if there's any questions with the map that you'd like to have with Scott or with myself or with Randall, then we have time to do that. So with that said, Scott, if you'd like to come on up and introduce yourself and kind of give a background of who you are and what you do. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. My name is Scott Rushing. I'm with Half Associates, and I'm a H&H engineer, or drainage engineer. I've been doing this for 16 years. I focused most of my career on master drainage planning, so I've done several studies like the one I'll go over with you tonight throughout DFW and throughout Texas. The main thing I want to focus on tonight is how we arrived at the blue mapping that you see up here on the map, okay? So my study was focused more on, as Mayor Johnson said, the macro level, looking at major systems, major collections and streams and ponds and whatnot. It wasn't so much a focus on the ditches that are in front of your homes. We'll talk some about that as well. But just wanted to let you know this is more high level, kind of big picture, how we arrived at the mapping that you see on the screen. Up here, and probably in some of your packets, maybe some of y'all have a map that was handed out. But I'll talk about this study and how we arrived at the mapping. So go a little bit of the project background. Next slide. So Double Oak has obviously experienced a lot of flooding over the years, been a lot of significant events in the past 5 to 10 years. Some of the challenges associated with the town, you're in Denton County, it's one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. So there's a lot of development occurring. I know most of Double Oak development, there's a lot of area outside of Double Oak that drains into your town that's being very rapidly developed, such as the Vickery and other developments like that. Retrofitting existing systems can be very challenging. There are some existing channels, there are some existing storm drains that are underground that convey water. Trying to upsize those or retrofit those can be a challenge, can be very costly. It's a very common problem across DFW where you have a lot of infrastructure that may have been designed or developed a long time ago under different criteria, or with rainfall data that wasn't as accurate as we have today, or just different standards. And so what you end up with sometimes is systems that may be undersized, that then coming back and trying to upgrade them and increase their capacity can be very costly. One thing we want to focus on was preventing adverse impacts, not only within the town of Double Oak. So you don't want to fix one problem upstream and then cause another problem downstream. I'm sure y'all experienced that some over the years. But also want to be a good neighbor to the downstream receiving town, which is Flower Mound. So all the drainage from Double Oak does drainage into Flower Mound. So just making sure any of the improvements that end up being performed in Double Oak don't cause a problem in Flower Mound as well. Maintenance responsibility, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's mostly on the ditches and culverts that may be in front of your homes. And then we'll talk a little bit about funding strategy. for some of these major improvements. Next slide. So the key study objectives were to identify the existing flooding hotspots in the town. Those are located with the kind of purple rectangle that you see up here on the map. So we identified those as potential flooding hotspots. I'm sure you're all already aware of a lot of those, and the town is already aware of a lot of those. So we got a lot of feedback from the town and from other drainage complaints that have been collected over the years to help validate some of our results that were generated by our study. Another objective was to develop conceptual, kind of high-level improvements that would alleviate some of the flooding problems that we saw in some of these high flooding locations. And then to put together a high-level plan to assist with capital improvement projects, just planning. How do we go about doing these improvements over the years on more of a long-term, kind of multi-year, multi-phase type plan. So I want to talk a little bit about the modeling. I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I want to make sure you understand how the mapping on this up here was generated. So within within the study, there's hydrology and there's hydraulics. Okay, so hydrology is basically a study of how much water gets into your creeks, into your channels. When the rain falls on the ground, there's a certain amount that will saturate. The ground will take in a certain amount, right, until it gets saturated and wet, and then all the remaining water is just runoff that goes into your creeks and your channels. So that's hydrology. That's determining how much water is actually in the channels. And we use a program called HEC-HMS. That's a free program put out by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a very widely used program within our industry. For hydraulics, we use a program called InfoWorks ICM. It's a 2D modeling package. It's really the Cadillac of 2D modeling packages in our industry. So there's really not a better program out there to do 2D modeling in terms of hydraulics. And hydraulics is, once the water is in the creeks and the channels, how does it behave? How high does it get? How deep does it get? That's hydraulics. So those are the modeling platforms that we used. Some of the data that went into the models were land use and zoning files, so we needed to know what kind of land cover there is, not only within the town of Double Oak, but all the drainage area or land use outside of the town coming into the town. We use the latest land use and zoning information possible to help determine how much runoff does come into the town. Soils, so we have the latest soils information. Like I mentioned earlier, there's certain properties of different soils that how much can they take in when it rains, how much can they not take in. We made sure we took into account different soils across the town as well. Rainfall data, we use the latest and greatest rainfall data. It's called NOAA Atlas 14. It's all the latest rainfall gauges and information across the entire state and in the local area that we use for this study. 2019 TNRIS LiDAR data, that is the latest terrain data that we use, the latest available and best available terrain data for the town. So that's what we use, and when I say a 2D model, okay, we have a terrain, we have a surface, the rain falls on the surface, and then it goes wherever it goes. And you figure out how deep it gets at certain locations, kind of where your low-lying areas, where your locations of more concentrated flow. That's what a 2D model does, and a big part of that is the terrain that you use, the ground data that you use. And the LiDAR data is actually very accurate, it's very detailed information. We use record drawings or as-built plans for a lot of the existing storm infrastructure or culverts that are throughout the town. And then we did field visit and data collection for up to 25 critical culverts throughout the town. And when I'm talking about culverts for the model, I mean culverts that take drainage from one side of the road to the other, not the smaller culverts in front of your homes or your driveways. These are the more significant culverts that are taking water from one side to the other in your more deeper kind of concentrated flow locations. So we wanted to make sure we got the 25 largest locations that would have an impact on our results and got those incorporated into our model. Slide. So flooding hotspot identification, there were 13 areas that were identified in the purple polygons. Potentially flooded structures were identified. So you'll see when you come around the map, there are some green polygons. They represent the buildings. So just little shapes that represent the building outline of a home. And the way we determined if they were potentially flooded was we intersected that building polygon with the mapping, the blue mapping you see, okay? And if it touched that blue mapping, we just called it potentially flooded. It doesn't mean it necessarily is flooded. We didn't go out and do a survey of all the finished floors of everyone's property. So we have no way of confirming at this time if it really is or in the floodplain or not. But this is how we determine potentially flooded structures within the study. And then we looked at depth of roadway overtopping was determined. So this table up here, and you may not be able to see it, but it goes over the different flooding depths for the 100-year event for a lot of the major roadways that are within those purple polygons. So on at most, we saw 5 foot of flooding on Kings Road. We know it gets very deep down there during flood events. And then as low as, maybe half a foot to a foot in some of these locations. In general, for a 100-year event, we're seeing, anywhere from probably 1 to 3 foot of flooding over the roadway in some of these significant culvert crossings. All right, next slide.
Can I ask
So-
a question about that?
Sure, yeah.
So is the criteria for the 100-year floodplain on the depth of water, is it measured at the crest of the road, is that?
Yes, at that, for those locations, yes. It was measured at the culvert location, which is usually the lowest part of the road. So you take that elevation of the road and how deep does it get over that crown, right, correct, over the road.
Right. So if it was 1 foot, then on your 100-year plan, instead of a foot about that level,
Correct.
basically is what would normally be expected.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
if you're driving down the road and you drive through it, don't do that. If you're driving through it, it would be a foot deep.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, understand, thank you.
Did you, do another quick question, just for in terms of data, did you have access to any floodplain data?
We did not. It's something you could request from FEMA, but really the only FEMA floodplain data you may get would be along Timber Creek, your main creek on the south side. Much of the blue mapping you see, it's not FEMA mapping. This is just local floodplain mapping generated from our study. So we do not have claims data, no.
Okay.
It's something that could be requested if we needed to get that.
Do you want to reference, since they're on that, about the fact that this doesn't mean that those green buildings that are notated on here, that you have to go out and get flood insurance? That everything we talk about tonight has nothing to do with the fact that we're in a floodplain area and you have to have FEMA flood insurance. So rest assured, it came up in one of the others, hey, my house is in the green up here and I live over here. Does that mean I need to have flood insurance? No, it does not.
For some people, it would have been nice if they had flood insurance.
That is, and that's the only thing we're saying. Is you
Right.
can go get it if you want it, but it's not required based upon this.
Very cool. It's cheap.
So it's right. So FEMA is not going to require you. A lender's not going to require you to purchase flood insurance unless you're in a FEMA floodplain, FEMA regulated floodplain. Most of the mapping you see on the screen is not. It's not. Would it be a good idea to purchase flood insurance for some people? Maybe, yes. And we're not here to say one way or the other, but it's not a requirement from FEMA or from a lender.
I was just suggesting claims data could feed actual, these physical places on your map actually did flood. So that would be just informative to your analysis.
Correct. So we did take some of the, like local feedback from Randall and others over the years, just where homes have flooded.
Yeah.
So we did use that to help validate our results, but it was not official FEMA claims information. Okay, so for the prioritization of these locations, we had 3 main criteria. We looked at the number of parcels affected by the 25-year flood event. So the purpose of that was just identifying the impacted properties within those purple polygons. And then we looked at the depth of flow at the 25-year and 2-year storm event along those properties. This is to determine the severity and the frequency of flooding. So severity would be the depth of flooding that you would see on the parcel. And the frequency would then, we would be able to determine that by looking at not only a 25-year event, but a 2-year event. A 2-year event is a flood event that statistically could happen, 50% chance every single year. So you've probably seen that event over the past 2 to 5 years in the town, and I'm sure maybe worse. But the 2-year event would indicate what the frequency of flooding may be. So in some of these purple polygons, there's a lot of flooding for the 100-year event. But there's some where there's really not any for a 2-year, but there are some that do have 2-year. And that would kind of tell you, well, in this location, they're probably experiencing flooding more often, there's more frequency of it.
Have we had a 225 or 100-year event?
I have not gone back and looked at historical data on that, so I'm not entirely sure.
I'm just curious if some of the flooding we've had in the spring for the last couple of years qualify for a 2, 10, 25, or 100-year floodplain. I know that's a FEMA term.
Correct.
But for us, it seems like it's a little bit more common than every 25 years.
Right.
Yeah, I got that as a note.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good question. The third criteria was overtopping of the roadway, and we looked at the 25-year event for that, and that's just for safety and emergency access. You mentioned earlier about the depth of flooding over the roadway. We looked at that criteria too, just to help prioritize some of the locations that we looked at for improvements. Okay, next slide. So conceptual alternatives. And I want to mention these are conceptual, these are planning level alternatives that are up here on the map and that I'll mention here shortly. They are not fully designed alternatives. They are not ready to go out and be constructed. So these are very concept level just for planning purposes. Give you an idea of the scale of improvements that would be needed and the scale of the costs that would go into implementing these improvements. So there were several improvements that are mentioned in the packets that you all have, but they're up here on the map as well. So there's a couple locations for potential regional detention that are in the red polygons. And then there's a couple locations for storm drain improvements, which are the yellow lines that you see on the map. And we took a concept idea of what size those would need to be, try to find the best alignment possible to mostly follow the roadway or available right-of-way to try to minimize impact to private property. You're going across private property, you need easements, we're just trying to avoid disruption to private property and try to stay at least within the roadway. That's how we determine generally the alignment for the storm drain improvements. One thing I want to mention just on a global scale so you understand, we proposed or put in the two big regional detention locations because that's a way to try to offset some of the increases in discharge you may have going into Flower Mound as a result of kind of larger scale improvements throughout the town of Double Oak. So let's say you did go out and implement one of those longer storm drain improvement projects. There used to be a lot of flooding. A lot of that water is storing right there in the town of Double Oak. Now if you try to collect it, it's no longer storing there. It's moving out a lot faster, going downstream. And a lot of times that will result in higher discharges and higher elevations and higher flooding downstream, not only in Double Oak, but also in Flower Mound. So the regional detention ponds, the concept or idea is to construct those first as part of a multi-year, multi-phase plan. And that would then offset some of those increases that you would see from some of the more larger scale storm drain improvements throughout the town. So that kind of goes into my conclusion. It's mostly just saying, to produce no adverse impact, that approach that I just mentioned is something that would need to be put into place. There's a lot of administrative things that can occur. We mentioned those in the report. Mayor Johnson alluded to those about maintaining your ditches. Those are the more, not macro, what's the other word? Micro, thank you. Micro scale improvements and just maintenance, general maintenance of some of the systems throughout the town. Education, we're here tonight doing education on flooding issues and maintaining existing features, and then also how do we put together a plan for more significant improvements throughout the town. Mentioned some of the grant opportunities, they're in your packet. Grants are a great way to help fund some of these improvements. A lot of times it's kind of 75, maybe 80% funding that you get from the funding entity. And then there's a local match that has to be put in from the town, which generally 25 to 20%, depending on which program or which grant opportunity that the town may go after in the future. There's some other ways to help fund some of the more micro scale maintenance type activities, which would be through a stormwater utility. There's a lot of information in your packet on stormwater utilities. I won't get into a ton of detail right now, but it is a way to help generate an enterprise fund. It's dedicated dollars that go towards only funding drainage-related services, whether that's studies or improvements or maintaining your existing system. What that looks like is typically in Texas, well, actually in Texas, there's about 145 stormwater utilities. So there's 145 communities that have a stormwater utility. The average fee is about $5 to $6 per month for a residential homeowner. And that increases for commercial properties. It's based off of impervious area. So the more impervious area you have, the higher your monthly fee would be. Majority of the town of Double Oak is residential homeowners or property owners. Just so you know, that's an average $5 to $6 per month for a residential property owner is what a stormwater utility.
Ours would be higher just because we're minimum 1 acre lots.
Okay, so correct. So there's different tiers, different size lots, different fees that you could put together for different lot sizes. So I'm not here to talk about that. We have not pulled together a detailed stormwater utility plan, but it's just one option the town could look at to help fund some of the maintenance activities and help fund some of the smaller scale improvements.
Comment?
Yes, sir.
I retired here from South Lake. In 2010, I think South Lake did that specifically. It was a stormwater drainage piece. I don't know, I didn't see it listed here, but you might be able to reach out to South Lake and see how that went. But it seemed to, it was pretty painless. It was $8 a month, I think, that as residents on like half-acre lots, and it seemed to was a nice funding source to cover some of those issues.
So yes, but I want to be very clear with the citizens that if we were to move towards something like that, we would have specific public hearings based upon that stormwater utility. South Lake, Lake Dallas, I know 4 or 5. We are going to go do our due diligence, but in essence, and I appreciate you sharing this, you know, we pride ourselves in Double Oak of having the lowest property tax or the lowest tax rates in DFW. And you can call it a stormwater utility, whatever, you can call it whatever you want. But what is it? It's tax. So we'll be mindful of all that. And yeah, I do think that we're going to need to, from a standpoint of the due diligence of it, and I'm sure the discussion is going to morph into where we're going to address this in a little bit more detail as it relates to the fact that the town has some ownership in here as it relates to, we own all the cross culverts. So if you've got a street and you've got a culvert underneath the street, that's Double Oak's responsibility. And I think if you live over on Cross Timbers, if you live in Meadow in a couple places, and there's many around the town, that we get that 2-year flood event and water tops the road. Why does it top the road? Well, do we have the accurate sized pipes that go underneath the street? We can't answer that yes or no if we do at this moment, but that's where coming out of this study and all the notes that we have even after the next one, that's an area that the town can address. So, you know, we had a roads and drainage committee for many, many years, and we always addressed crack seal, we always addressed mill and overlay. We didn't do a lot with drainage, very little, if any. We've separated those committees now, and so when it goes to do the budget, and when it goes to look to allocate funding, we're gonna have to do things with roads, and we know we're gonna have to do things with drainage moving forward, specifically to the cross culverts. So how do we go faster? The possibility of going faster and making bigger improvements would be something like that. But rest assured, at least as long as I'm around, that'll come to the town will have its say, the council will listen, but we're not anywhere near that, folks. Not anywhere near that. We're just getting started on this. But yeah, there are ways, and we have a new town administrator who is well schooled in going out and getting grants and things like that. We're going to be looking at those possibilities as well. If you look at the total package that's put into this study, it's $54 million. Anybody want to take a guess on what our budget is? Our annual budget is here? A little over $2 million, thank you. We've been trying to keep it as low as we can. $2 million. So how do we do $54 million with $2 million budget? It's virtually impossible. I did the math. Well, I did it and I overlaid it over 5 years. It's only $8,800 assessment per year for 5 years per parcel. Or if we do it over 10, it's 44. I actually had a gentleman come up to me afterwards and says, "Are you kidding me?" And I said, "No, I mean, if you just do straight math, that's real to try and cover this." Reality is that's not reality. That is not reality. We know that, right? So how are we going to go about doing this? And I think as this discussion proceeds, you're going to hear a lot about drainage ditches. You're going to hear a lot about how water flows in this town, because Randall works it every single day. And your Q&A is going to drive some discussions in different ways. And I'm excited when we get to that discussion. And we'll get real close. Will you do me a favor, though, and share with retention versus detention and why we have our ponds here?
So for retention and detention ponds, there's a difference. So generally, retention ponds usually remain wet. Okay, and there's usually not a lot of, I would say, flood benefit from retention ponds. There is some flood benefit from them, but generally they're wet. And a detention pond is typically dry. So during a flood event, it will be dry at the beginning, it'll fill up, and then it'll release water at a certain slower rate to a kind of pre-development condition. So detention ponds are generally more geared towards a flood benefit. Retention ponds are a lot of times amenities, and they do provide some flood benefit, but that's not their main function, if that makes sense.
So, for example, the ponds in Twin Lakes, are those retention or detention? Retention.
Which ones are Twin Lakes?
Twin Lakes.
Correct.
6 ponds.
Well,
They're all,
I can answer that. Hey, Scott. Those are actually, so the ones in Twin Lakes are retention.
Yeah.
Every summer, at the end of the summer, you'll see their dries above.
Okay, so they're
Not completely.
retention.
Not completely.
They're detention.
They're detention.
Two summers I've seen it.
No, they're not dry.
So
They're not all
detention
dry.
is a dry pond.
Just 2 of them.
Yeah, just 2 of them. And we got close at the end of right before fall on another one.
when correct, when they well, sounds like when there's a drought, maybe they become dry.
Yeah.
There's maybe some flood benefit then, right? But,
Right? Nathan just pulled the fountain and looked.
but in general, they're wet, and in general, they already have water in them. So when the flood happens, there's not a ton of flood storage there. It's just generally a pass.
The one just south of Victory, that one, is that, that's a permanent, so
That's retention.
That would be a retention.
That is correct.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, that was it. If any other questions on retention or detention?
So, yeah, so I know the one just south across Rivers, the one up south of Victory, right there, yeah. That one was dredged, I think the homeowners got together about 10 years ago and,
2002.
okay, but that one was 20 years ago.
That's 20 years ago.
That's what they said the other night.
Okay, and they paid for dredging that, right? Okay, was there any encouragement from the city on that action?
No.
Because I understand the ponds in Twin Lakes are basically soaked up too, which means their ability to hold water is limited.
Nathan,
We have a couple of...
if you could stand.
Yeah, sure. We do have a couple of ponds that we've been told need to be dredged. Specifically the ones on the northern part of our quadrant, because we now have Vickery that's doing their runoff into the ponds, and we have a lot of muck and different stuff that came from that development. But the bigger ponds probably don't need dredging, but that's always been a problem in our community because it's expensive to do dredging, and it's also, I don't know, people just don't like it. It's been a hot topic. But I mean, it's different when you're talking about, is it gonna really affect the drainage, right? Then it becomes a different discussion altogether.
And if you don't know Nathan, he's the president of the Twin Lakes Homeowners.
Isn't there a risk though, if you dredge those, that they won't hold water after you
Yeah,
dredge?
that's been some of the cross.
Because one of ours in Twin Lakes, behind the Kinders, they dredged it years ago.
And it doesn't hold much.
It doesn't hold much water.
It's the one
They
that's dry.
cut through that gypsum
Right.
and all that.
Yeah, it's true, you take away the clay.
So don't dredge the one behind my property.
Yeah, no.
I'm at 325 Kings.
I know where you are.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
it's all the lake you got going east to west down the bottom. That's Timber Creek, right? And south of that is Farm Mountain.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
So one of the questions I have is, these retention ponds you've identified, the building, the big dollar ones, those don't really do a whole lot for double oak. It just provides a place for the water drain out of double oak to be stored, so it doesn't screw with the folks in Flowerman. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's really, those projects are all beneficial to Flower Mound, not necessarily beneficial to double oak.
If they provide some place for the water to go, though, that's.
Yeah, but the water, the flooding is not necessarily to keep flooding from double oak, that's a place to keep flooding from downstream, which would be Flower Mound.
If I speak wrong, so all of this water that comes down through here hits here and comes this way. In this instance, a lot of that water would be dropped down into this space. Would that be correct, Scott?
Correct, into the creek there?
Yeah, it would come down here versus coming down the creek.
Right, and the same thing with this other one. So the idea with the other one is to actually offset some of the drainage from the south and then to kind of over-retain that location to where then you can increase the peak from north. So there would be some benefit for the portion of Timber Creek that's within Double Oak, yes. And then yes, it would be a benefit downstream to Flower Mound, but it really is part of an overall strategy to help facilitate doing the major storm drain improvement projects.
I read your study, and you put a lot of effort, time into the Vickery development. And obviously they're not even part of Double Oak. So is the Vickery, and you've already mentioned it a couple of times, is the Vickery development adding a lot to the drainage of the water coming into Double Oak?
So, okay, it's a great question, and we're in Quadrant 3, so I didn't know how much detail you want to know about Vickery, but I'm happy to answer questions about Vickery. So, we took the design plans from the engineer for Vickery, and we incorporated that information into our model. So, I mentioned from the very beginning that there's a lot of drainage area that flows into the town, okay, and at Vickery in particular, this was done, they regraded it a year ago, 2 years ago. When did they do all the grading out there? It's pretty recent, right? So our base LiDAR data is 2019, so it was done after that. So there was no way for me to incorporate that terrain into the model without going out and doing a lot of surveying. So we weren't funded to do that. So the way that we did incorporate the Vickery improvement was they had several locations of now concentrated discharge coming into the town. Now maybe it used to be a little bit more spread out, but now it's more concentrated coming in at certain locations, not just there to the south, but also off to the east, and there's some outfalls that go off to the north. So we took all the drainage area coming to those points, and we incorporated the design from the engineer who designed those ponds. They designed certain outlet structures, weir structures, culverts that drain those ponds. We took that information and incorporated that into our study so that we could get the amount of water coming into the town at those specific points. Does that make sense? So in terms of answering your question about did it increase or decrease, the engineer who did the study showed that the post-development discharge coming into the town was at or below the pre-development discharge coming into the town. It wasn't my job to go vet that and look that to the nth degree. It was my job to take their design, get it into my model, and make sure I had the amount of water coming into the town modeled appropriately for Double Oak.
Maybe it's part of the LDAR, but is the LDAR the same? Is that a contour type map? You said it's 2D, so I'm thinking contour. Do we have a contour map of Double Oak?
The LiDAR data, you can generate contours from that, so we do have contour information, yes.
I mean, my thinking is with the contour map, you could pretty well identify where the water's flowing. It's going to flow downhill most of the time.
Correct.
So do we have a contour map? I mean, to identify the low spots? And then from there, I'm assuming these programs allow you to calculate the acre feet of water from a quarter-inch rain, a half-inch rain, a 1-inch rain, because that's where we have the problems when we have a 1-inch rain or a 1.5-inch rain in a period of hours.
Yeah, so what you can do, we can model storm events that frequent if we wanted to. The most frequent one we did was the 2-year. And what you can do with the model is, any point in the model where you see the flooding, the blue, we can take, you just take a line, right, in the model, and it'll pull up how deep it gets, what's the flow rate, so you can pull information anywhere in the town.
Well, that's a different piece, that knowing where the water is standing is one thing, but knowing where the water's coming from
How did it get there?
is a different question.
Okay.
So these retention ponds, where's the water coming from? Is it, coming from the immediate area? I mean, I'm on Cedar Crest, so, we have everything on Cedar Crest flows south. Right through there. And all that water, it's going to flow south, so it's eventually going to end up in Timber Creek.
Right.
But, what you're saying is, we don't, I'm not hearing you say we do have a contour map. So we know where the water stands, we don't know where it's coming from to get to these spots.
We could add a contour map if we wanted to. We did delineate drainage areas, the drainage areas that are coming into the town. We delineated drainage areas within the town. So those divides, you have your ridges and your high points, and you determine where the water goes from there. So the program does all of that for you because it knows where the high ground is, it knows where the low ground is. So if rain falls up on the ridge, it's just going to drain down to the low point and get in the creek.
I understand that, but we don't know where what you're telling me is today we don't know where the high points are.
We do.
We know where the low points are.
We know where the high points are too, and if we need to add a contour map, we can certainly put contours on the map and show that. Yeah.
The other question I had, going back, is there any water anywhere outside of Double Oak where water is draining into Double Oak other than Big Creek?
Right here.
Okay.
That mostly goes.
Or, I'm sorry, I'm over here, Taylor Oaks, right here.
Yeah, there, here, anything coming up from the south. So we see this kind of mapping out outside of this. Okay, so the town boundary really is this orange line. So you see some mapping that's outside of the town. That's because our model did extend outside of the town. So we made sure to collect all that information, all that water that comes into the town. Now you don't see it here because I mentioned this is, newer terrain data that's not in our model. We couldn't actually run a 2D model up here. We just had to identify how much water comes in here and here into the town. If that makes sense. So we did take into account all the drainage area from outside the town as well.
We have had a lot more water coming in here into Taylor Oaks. And now this is all Bartonville up in here. We've noticed that in the last couple of days. You want to talk to that?
Put it up here. So when we talk about Taylor Oaks on the northern portion, just to touch base on it real quick, I know that you are here for Quadrant 3, but in regards to Taylor Oaks design was actually, that was taken into consideration. It's actually on their development plans for receiving water from the northern end of that, because there is a community that's just north of that. It's a residential community. And so it does take water from north of it and drops it down south into their detention/retention pond. It was actually intended it was developed another way, but the water continues to expand in there. And so it does have different qualities to it. There was actually a detention pond there along with the retention. So if there's an overfill, and then there's an emergency level that actually relieves water that actually will go across Kings and actually go into Timberview. So when they developed there, so of course that's a newer development, and the standards for that were actually put into place because we have an ordinance under the drainage policy that went into effect and was adopted in 2000. Taylor Oaks was developed after that, and Taylor Oaks actually adheres to that development plan. A lot of residential properties in Double Oak don't fall within that requirement because that ordinance wasn't in place where most of the residents live now in the older communities. So I will say that we do receive water north of us from Bartonville into Taylor Oaks. When they did that development, it was taken into consideration. When I've looked at it, it's got about it's got probably about 10 to 12 arrows that are on the receiving end. There's several residents, there's at least 4 or 5 residents that it sweeps across the back of their property, goes into a drop inlet, a 4-part inlet, and then it actually goes out towards the west and then drops down south of the community, then crosses back over, and it goes actually into their retention or detention pond, however you want to call it. Well, just for the purpose of the conversation, it's their pond. So that's how that one's received. When we talk about Quadrant Estates, which we briefly touched on previously, that one's actually supposed to go out over 407. Most of the community is supposed to drain out over 407. It's a very slow dissipation of it. Quadrant Estates residents had a very long conversation about that, and we talked about additional study regarding that particular piece, but we do realize that a lot of water does gather there and then it actually shoots out. We do have some that comes actually from Simmons that crosses the larger agricultural properties that are actually out there that move towards that direction. They were already there. There is actual retention pond that actually exists out there. It's pre-existing to Quadrant Estates, and that water, when it reaches a certain level, actually has an outfall, and it actually has a spillway where there's a relief that actually was intended there. And the residential properties that are impacted by that, there's about 4 or 5 properties there as well, and they're designed for their drainage around their properties. Actually, on each one of their plats and their surveys, it actually indicates they have 4-part drainages all the way around their property. And so when they developed it, it was also taken into consideration regarding that type of drainage. Now, again, we're not talking about 100-year floodplain. It's just under your normal development regulations, which we have the coefficiency ratings for the drainage policy. It actually talks about that, but again, that ordinance was put in place long after most of the development that actually happened in Double Oak, and that's actually talking about newer developments or development standards if you're making improvements on the property, which you would be required to follow if you were doing a new development.
And those are areas that we don't really have a lot of trouble, right?
Typically, yeah, correct.
They've done their homework and they've kind of built for that. So I haven't seen a lot of flooding over Taylor Road, for sure.
Correct. And I don't know if you mentioned it, but I know this is something that gets talked about a lot. So Double Oak has had drainage issues since day one, okay? Now, were there as many homes? No. But again, at some point they realized in 2000 that they needed ordinances that helped for the newer developments that came into place. Pre-existing, there's not a lot. I'm not saying that there was nothing, but there wasn't a lot that said that, hey, we hold fast to this and this is what you're supposed to do. One of the discussions that I was going to talk about tonight, that we are going to talk about tonight, is talking about stronger ordinances so that we have something to fall back on. Every property, I will preface with this, because this was actually a discussion in the last meeting as well. Not every property is the same. So if you're at the top of the hill, regarding a culvert underneath your driveway is not indicative. It's not something that you absolutely need to do from a development standpoint. But as you crest down the hill and you have driveways and you have a culvert or you have a drainage ditch that's in the front of your property, you will need them, and they need to meet certain mandates. So if you have a larger pipe at the top of the hill and you try to drop it down to a smaller pipe at the bottom of the hill, it's never going to work and it wouldn't even be allowed. So we do have standards for that. It does fall within that drainage policy, and it also indicates that you have to have, a lot of people have, some of y'all have 12-inch pipes underneath your driveway. I've seen some as small as 10. I've seen people with more than one. I've seen some that are completely piped underneath. Every property is different. We realize that. But we do need to have at least some standard in place that says, hey, we already have an ordinance that dictates, hey, you have to maintain your property, you're responsible for it. Typically, in most cases, the residential properties owners actually own out to the middle of the road. Not everywhere, but in most cases. So the town can't really go in and make necessary improvements on someone's property because we don't actually own it. And technically, kind of like just to fall back to what he said earlier, we don't have the money to actually go to everybody's property and make the necessary improvements. And we don't actually have a fee or a fee structure in place that we can take those capitalized funding and be able to facilitate the changes that are needed. We do things such as maintain, crack seal, and then deal with mill and overlay or complete remodeling. Now, I will tell you this: our newest road project, we did identify areas where deficiencies were in the road that may lead to pipe fixes that was included in the funding. So we are looking at stuff like that, but we need something independent from that that actually facilitates that. One of the quickest changes that we can make outside of going straight into dealing with funding is ordinances that are a little bit stronger on the verbiage that gives us the ability to enforce it. Now, what does that look like? Well, that's what we need to discuss. And one of the things that we talk about, and this is just an example. I had to say this the last meeting. Some people walked away with it and go, how am I going to get this 3-to-1 ratio, 8 foot wide? You're going to take my trees out. You're going to take, that's not what this is. This is an example of a bar ditch. And this is a 3-to-1 ratio. Basically what it is it essentially has a 2-foot ditch bottom with a taper. So for every foot you go down, for 1 foot down, you need to extend 3 foot wide at a slow taper down into the bottom of the bar ditch area, is what that is.
Erosion control?
It's somewhat for erosion control, but it's also to basically move the water down the path in the areas that are indicated for it. Again, with the preface that not every property is the same and not all will develop that. I've got some properties in Double Oak, Patrick actually lives in one of them, where they designed it with drainage flows in the front of the property, on the side of the property, and in some cases across the rear of the property where they move the water. So there's not necessarily everybody's the exact same package. The development indicated that a lot of the older communities, like on Meadow, Knoll, and where you have Cross Timbers Drive, you'll see several properties that have bar ditches that are maintained, and then you'll come across some and it looks like there's literally no culvert, or if there is, it's barely peaking. It doesn't actually have any sunlight in it, you just know because the metal's sticking up on the lip, and then flat, then you have a completely flat front of the property. The problem is we don't have an ordinance that says, hey, by the way, Randall, you can go out there and tell them, hey, you need to maintain that, you haven't taken care of that, and that's one thing that we do need to change so that we can enforce that. Now, when we talk about an enforcement piece in an ordinance, that would be something that would go before the council, that would be decided. We do have an ordinance board now that actually is going to assist and help facilitate that. But ultimately, it needs to be in a way that gives the residents enough time to be able to make the necessary changes. So what I mean by that is this. What we're not trying to do as a town is go, hey, by the way, we have this ordinance, we're coming next week, we're going to impose this new ordinance on you, you got to fix it, and you got 2 weeks to do it. And then the next thing you know, you got people who are on fixed income who can't go out and make these major changes immediately, and it could cost, depending on who you hire, could cost a lot of money. And it impacts. It doesn't matter if it's $1 or if it's thousands of dollars. If you don't have the money, you don't have the money. And so when you put an ordinance like this in a place, you also have to think about the amount of time. So I'll give an example. The municipality that I came from in Irving, we had a fence ordinance that was in place for a very, very long time, and they made some changes. When they did it, they put a date in place that said you had to come in compliance if you had this type of fence within about, I believe it was like a 3-year time frame. It was enough time for people to build up the necessary funding to make those changes so that when it came time, they were able to make the corrections. So I want to preface with saying when we make the ordinance change, it's going to have to be something that's palatable. We do have to get everybody on board with it, but at the same time, it's at least an earmark to say, hey, you have something you have now that's in place that you have to adhere to. And of course, we're going to be, not only is the ordinance board going to be looking at that, but then we would also ultimately have the attorney take a review of that. And we've actually already started looking at local municipalities around us, Bartonville, Copper Canyon, Shady Shores, and a few of the others that actually have, and every one of us have a different style ordinance for things. And so depending on the type of flooding issues, depending on the kind of water that's going through, and so we're actually looking at that as well.
This example here, Cross Timbers,
Yes,
that
sir.
bar ditch, it looks like its purpose is to allow water to drain off the road quickly. I mean, is that bar ditch benefiting homeowners, or is it benefiting the road?
So there's already watershed on roads. So say like the surface was flat. It's actually there to benefit the homeowner. It's supposed to collect water in there and then move it away. If we didn't have that, let's just say that it was flat, there was no bar ditch there. I'm not saying all roads in Double Oak are perfect. We realize that a lot of them need to be changed. But in the case where they do a brand new road, they do have a ratio that they adhere to where the water shedding goes off the road. It's not supposed to collect on the road. There's supposed to be a peak at the center. Mind you, it's not some massive peak, but there is supposed to be a peak at the center of it that moves water and it sheds it off to each side of the road. Under heavy rain events, it's concrete, so absorbs very little, and then it eventually pushes it off on the property. If you have a flat surface, the next thing you know, depending on how your drainage is on your property, you're receiving it at your front door. Bar ditches are put in place to help receive the water and move it away from the property towards the flow of the area that it's supposed to go into. And all of it's really supposed to travel south in most cases.
Well, and you're assuming that you think bar ditches think along roadways, but like you said over there in Pat's area, they got bar ditches between the homes and behind the homes. I mean, they're covered every which way, but the old, the older homes, they only have bar ditches up at the street, if any.
And you're not wrong about that. And then I also take things like this into consideration. Things change. The homes that are 30 or 40 years old, if someone, especially with newer homeowners that come into the area, you'll get a home and it may look flat. It may not have been intended that way from the onstart. It may have been developed in a different look when it started off, and it had a different flow. But as time went on, as long as it's not broke, you don't fix it. But as soon as you realize there's an issue, then you start looking, well, why do I have the issue? Without realizing, unless you actually get your property surveyed or looked at, you may have an issue that's on the property due to a maintenance issue that's never been maintained along the way, and then you get a change between homeowners. I'm not saying that's the case in every one of them. There's a different scenario for each property. The point being is everyone needs to take the time to actually look at their property and assess what that looks like. There are some development maps for different communities. It's a little harder when you get to things like Meadow area. I looked for theirs for a very long time and was not able to find. I even went to Denton County Record to try to find at least a topographical map that at least gives you some idea, saying, hey, it starts at 230 and then it drops down in certain areas. So at least you get an idea, hey, this is the top of the hill and this is where it flows downward. I have some of those in some communities so I can at least get some kind of an idea as to which way the water's supposed to flow. And in those cases when residents are making those improvements, if they need it, I definitely try to get it over to them. In a lot of cases when they're doing major improvements, they'll have somebody come out and survey it with their company usually has an engineer. They come out and look at the property, they check the flow levels, and they make sure to send it off according to what that is. But that is, when you make improvements, kind of talking about what we were talking about earlier, when we talk about making improvements, especially with those being the major ones, okay? Let's say that we decide to, say like we're 10 years down the road and we decide to start making major changes. The changes more than likely will start in the south because that's where the water's going to collect from everybody else. You don't make fixes on the north end, on the high point of the hill, because all you're doing is sending water quicker down to the people who are already having the flooding issue. So you start at the bottom and you work your way up. So that's another thing that we have to think about whenever we're making those changes is, hey, by the way, it's going to usually start in the south and we're going to work our way up when we're making those necessary changes. And also it depends on how bad of an issue that we're actually talking about. With that stated, we have had engineer studies done in the past where everybody was ready to go forward. The town paid good money to have the engineer study done. They got the plan together. It's time to hit the road, and then all of a sudden one or two property owners say, yeah, you're not putting that through my property. That kills it, especially when you're dealing with private property and you're moving between private property owners. Everyone else has to have the buy-in as well whenever we're talking about that. So to kind of point towards what Scott said earlier, a lot of the stuff that he actually put on the map that you actually see in the yellow typically is following the drainage areas and then moving it within the right-of-way, as I use that loosely because not everybody has a right-of-way, but actually near the road or at least in the road whenever you're moving the water, because we do realize the local residents own almost everything. This is Youngstown. We're just here to assist. Yes, sir.
Just wanted to emphasize that we do need some clarification work, some ordinance work done. There's a lot of confusion. I've had people say you can't drain across subdivisions. And I've had people even plugging other people's drains but you're in Twin Lakes and we're over here in Colonial Court. There's a lot of confusion around it, and some people say, well, I used to know the engineer that started Double Oak, and and he said we're not allowed to drain over here, but then you go further up the street, and it's made purposely to drain between the two divisions. We're supposed to drain into it. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion that needs to be cleared up on the ordinances.
Which absolutely segues into what we were talking about earlier. We need ordinances that gives us strong representation about how to move forward with that. And again, it's not a cookie cutter representation for every single address. Everyone's different.
Right.
An example of that would be like at Thornhill Estates. When I actually first came on, it was during one of our heavy events, and so I spent a lot of time reading a lot of people's individual property surveys and then going out and having long conversations, reading deed restrictions and covenants for HOAs, particularly in Thornhill Estates, only to come to find out while you can't see the pipe and the land looks flat, doesn't mean that they may not have pulled a permit, and then they basically put all their culverts underground. And this one particular address actually found it. And so I had to sit down with the other homeowners and let them know they actually do. They are draining it. It is effective. They do have inlets that receive it. It was something that was permitted. It is covered, and it is effective, and it does meet the plan requirements. That's what's great about the ordinance that we have now that fits the needs of anybody who's trying to move forward with new improvements. But it doesn't really do us any good for those that are pre-existing. So there's a term that's used a lot. I try to stay away from it just because I've been in the business with it, but a lot of people say grandfathered a lot, right? That's actually not a legal term. The legal term is legal non-conforming. Okay, so pre-existing to an ordinance actually be introduced. So I can't come to your house and tell you, by the way, you got to meet this new coefficient that was in 2000 and your house was built in 86. But if you do make a new improvement, I can. And I will go back to that ordinance. So a lot of times when culverts are changed, a lot of people look at it and they go, well, why do I have to go with RCP and why do I have to go with 18 inches? Mine's a 10 inch, mine's a 12 inch. This is ridiculous. I don't have enough depth to my bar ditches out in the front. My water's not going to move through it. And that's when we get into the conversations talking about coefficiency. You do have to put 18 inch because it is the mandated requirement now, and you do need to clear out that area. Now, again, on the top of the hill, there are engineer studies that can be done. The residents pay for that, for our engineer to do that review, or they can have their engineer do it, but they're still going to pay for ours to review it to see if it follows our policies, and then at that point we would go from there. But in most cases, not all, whenever there's a bar ditch that's improved, it's reinforced concrete pipe, which is RCP, 18 inch, and then we require to have head walls on them with a 3-to-1 ratio for safety purposes. You can't just stick a drop. And just shear cut it off on the other end because you see a lot of washout because of that. And then it gets under your driveway, and then you just spent tens of thousands of dollars on a driveway, and then all of a sudden the water's just tearing it out. There's reasons for the things that we do, and so that's why we follow the new policy that we actually have in place that came in 2000 when new improvements are made. So I don't go back and make people do new things, but when they do make the improvements, we make a contractor adhere to that.
You brought up a good point about drainage. There's places that hold water, and then there's places that don't hold water normally unless we get a heavy rain. And then it's all about moving the water quickly. And in our area, we have a problem. We have drainage, and it's good drainage until we have a heavy rain, and then the drainage doesn't move the water away fast enough. But here's the thing, if we did improve our drainage, it's going to screw the people downstream.
Yes, to a certain extent, you're not wrong. The other issue that falls into this, so talking about the Timber Creek holding area, okay, I want to cover that. So one of the things that is taken into consideration with that is in the FEMA floodplain. Let me be clear. You can go to Denton County, put Denton County FEMA in Google search, or whatever search engine you use. Just happen to tell you that's the one that I use the most. You can actually look at the FEMA floodplain map. They actually have a map that you can go on there. You can click 500 years, 100 years. And you can put your address in, and you can see if your property is affected by it. There are a couple of areas that do have 100-year floodplains. I want to preface with saying this. Just because something says it has a 100-year floodplain doesn't mean it's going to happen once every 100 years. It could happen every year for 5 years. It could happen every year for 10. Or it could do it, it doesn't happen for 25 years and all of a sudden it happens. I feel like since I came here, all of a sudden it decides that it needs to do it every year that I'm here. At least that's the way that it feels, okay? But the reality is 100-year floodplain is just an indicator that it does flood in that area. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen a certain way. God gets to decide that, not us. We just get to be the participants receiving the water and what that looks like. And so I get that a lot. And then I usually tell people, well, that's not exactly how it goes. And so I did actually at several council meetings at the beginning of the year indicate we had an above average rainfall this year. We actually Denton County met its quota for a full year within the first 4 months. And then we still kept getting rain. And we're not at the end of the year, we're at the end of the season, and now we're talking about receiving more rain. When you get that much water, this is another thing that comes on. We were talking about saturation of soil. So the ground can only take so much. Even under slow rain conditions over several days, the ground only absorbs so much, and then after that, it's just continues to push it off. At the beginning of the year, it seemed like we had pretty much every day, with one nice sunny day in between, and then like 6 days of ridiculous rainfall. And I kept getting calls, this has never happened before, this is not what it normally looks like, it never floods as much, it never swells as much. Well, they're not wrong that it doesn't normally do that, but you have to understand that's a baseline, not a fact, that you're going to get this particular kind of rain. We don't get to decide that. And when the ground's oversaturated, it takes forever. We had several issues in Quadrant Estates where water just kept trickling in. Well, the ground was so saturated, it takes weeks in some cases. If you're at the bottom of the hill, it's even worse. Your ground's oversaturated for a long period of time because everybody at the top of the hill slowly drains. And that doesn't necessarily mean water that's in your bar ditch or on your property that you can visually see. Within the first 12 inches of the soil, you can have water that's underneath it that you feel that's mushy. That water is slowly wringing itself out and moving downhill. And it takes literally weeks, and you need good conditions. Dry weather, summertime. I'm not a fan of summer, but summer is because it's ridiculously hot. But at the same time, it also serves its purpose. It dries our soil out. It helps with that so that we have that move on. So I just want to indicate, we realize that it's not always the exact same way. And it changes based on how much rain saturation we got. It's not perfect. We're human, we're not perfect, neither is the weather, and neither is your property. We do the best that we can with what we got. And so those things are taken into scale, which is one of the reasons that the policy that we have, drainage ordinance that we do have currently, is because they started to assess it and say, hey, anytime we have new improvement, that's going to affect our properties, and how are we going to disperse that water? So they put something in effect. That's why this drainage study was done. We haven't had anything done in a very long time. We need something that's practical. We need to assess our town and see what it looks like at this time, and then we need to start making the changes, which ultimately those affects our ordinances, our current infrastructure improvements that we need to do, and then maybe even major ones if we can palletize the amount and figure out a way that is that's not so burdensome to the residents, but also that we can efficiently make the necessary changes.
Is it correct that we have an ordinance that if you do something to improve drainage on your property, it can't be detrimental to a neighboring property?
So there's not necessarily an ordinance on there, but it is a state ordinance that's in place. And people hate it when I say this, but it really dictates that's a civil issue. And that's actually what it covers. Because we don't actually have an ordinance that I can go out and go, by the way, you're doing the wrong thing here, you need to do something else. So there is state law that covers it, but it's between property owner and property owner, and it's usually civil, because I don't have anything that I can go out and go, by the way, our ordinance says you can't do that.
Okay.
I'll give a prime example of that. When someone does their gutters and decides to put in French drains, there's not an ordinance for that. You can do that if you want to. You can call me, and I'll say, great. Yeah, you don't have to pay for that, and we don't need a plan for that. I do usually preface, you can't take your pipe and run it out to your fence line edge and then put it on your neighbor directly. You do need to have it at least several feet away so that your property can absorb it effectively and then it doesn't impact your neighbor. I can say that because it's common sense, but I don't have an ordinance that says you can't do that. And then that's where the issue comes in. So that's why we need some reform to our ordinances to be able to dictate that stuff.
And education, right? It wasn't until you came to my property and we walked in the back that I didn't even know that this thing was designed to slope to the back right, you know?
Yeah.
And the French drain was there when I moved in, so I thought it was supposed to be there until you told me, you know, you're collecting and piping, and that's forcing more water than you should. Versus letting it naturally disperse across the whole back of your property. So the education part is what I really want to hit on. This is great from a macro level, but I think each one of our homeowners, at least for me, having that knowledge helped me go, oh, well, yeah, I need to bring in some dirt. Man, I've lost a lot of dirt back here that I didn't even know I lost. And if I had some if I had some data that I could have gone back to that originally it was designed this way, it would have been easier for me to go, okay, this is where I need to improve my own property to help everybody else around me.
And I'll tell you this, whenever someone's making improvements on their property, not everyone usually has a survey. It doesn't mean that we always do. In most cases, we do. And there usually be some indicators on there. So not all of us read surveys every day. That just happens to be what I do. So I usually like to tell people, hey, that part on there that says DUE, that's your drainage utility easement. And it actually gives you an amount of footage on your property that is dedicated to a drainage easement. When you make, it's not that you can't make improvements in those areas, but if you are making improvements, you can't impede the drainage utility easement so that the flow can't move through. In your case, that actually, I was actually blown away because on both sides of the fences, y'all both have like, I think it was like 20 to 25 feet. And I was surprised by that. So that means that there's 50 feet of drainage utility easement between your community and the community that's next to
And
you.
there's a bunch of sediment all the way down to the
Yeah,
creek.
there is.
So, but we didn't know that because we weren't
Yeah.
here, when it was
Absolutely.
developed.
So
So,
are there existing drainage utility easements in Dublin?
Yes, but you would have to look at a property by property basis because some people, it's indicated on there. And that kind of goes back to what I was stating earlier. And you can bring me back at the subject if you feel like I'm diverting from it. If you're on the high end, there may be a drainage utility easement that's indicated on there only on one property or part of your property. But then if you're at an inlet at the bottom of the community, you may have 4 drainage utility easements on your property. So each one's different. And in some cases, so Meadow No always seems to come back for me because we met with a property owner who had no drainage utility easements on her property whatsoever. And so it really sucked for her because when it actually came down to flooding, the policy wouldn't let them, they couldn't acquire the policy because of the fact that it wasn't indicated on her actual survey, and it never was. It wasn't on there. But she does have drainage pipes that go onto her property, and she has one that goes under her culvert underneath her driveway, so it was a learning curve for all of us. But at the end of the day, every property is absolutely independently different. There are probably some that are similar, but no two are alike. I'll say it like that. So that's why we need a standardized policy that makes sense, and we need to review that together. We need to figure out what that looks like, and at least the minimum maintenance. We do, in our drainage policy that we do have, it does indicate that, but that makes it really hard, again, to what I said earlier. If your house was built in the 1980s, I can't go and tell you to do what it says in the 2000 policy unless you're making major improvements on your property, then I can have you adhere to it, because at that point you're pulling a permit, and this is what it says now.
So for clarification,
Yes,
if
sir.
there was a drainage utility easement on a property, would the city have the right to go in and do something?
No.
Okay, but you could enforce.
I could indicate that they have it on there and that they do need to maintain it. And I could even go as far as, if the development study's still there, I could at least give it to the resident to let them know which pathway it's supposed to be taking. How is the water flow supposed to be going? So at least if they do have somebody come out for the contractor to do it, they're probably gonna survey, but they're only gonna take so much information. If I have the development standard, I can at least give them that and say, hey, this is the direction it's supposed to go in. Does that answer your
That
question?
information is not available.
Not in all cases. In some cases it is, in some cases it's not. It's a case-by-case basis. For instance, if you lived in Taylor Oaks and you came to me, I'd say absolutely. I've got a whole construction survey plan. I can give you the whole development standard. I can tell you exactly where it's going. I can tell you the drop from one property to another. Ones that are built in the 80s, sometimes they took it into consideration, and other times they just built it. And I got some that just has just a resident card on it with no development for the house. I have no plans for the house, just a residential card that says they're going to build a house. I'm like, great. That tells me nothing, and I can't help these people out. So, case-by-case basis.
Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
So if I look at my ditch in my backyard that comes from the neighbors and down, it's pretty shallow. I'm the second house from the top. It's pretty shallow on the top, and then when it gets to the bottom, it's kind of deeper, but I have silt that washed down from there. Do I need a permit to dig that silt out?
No, but I will, so that reminds me of a conversation. I know you're already thinking it as soon as you said it. We always advise people to call Texas 811. Before you dig in the dirt, call Texas 811. Most people are familiar with dig tests. That's what I'm familiar with. when I worked in the private sector with Verizon. I used to have to tell people call that all the time because we were dropping fiber optics in early 2000 like it was going out of style or something. And so they were hitting a lot of things. So please call dig test before you actually put a shovel in the ground. We do realize that fiber optics does get late in Double Oak. There are standards that they're supposed to adhere to. They have rights for utilities to put them in. Doesn't mean they always put them in right, especially when service drops are being put in. And sometimes I've said this before, when newer developments go in, it's not the first time I would have seen it. I can't believe it happens, but they're supposed to bury it to a certain depth. I've seen them just throw it underneath the grass, lift up the grass, throw it in, and move on. Because to them, time is money. They don't even care about anybody else. Honestly, they're looking at thousands of dollars potentially at each dress. They're going to throw it in and move on. You're happy with it until you hit it. And so Texas 811 is there to protect you, though. If you call it and then you fall within the time frame, they have an adherence that you have to have depending on what you're doing. And then as long as you wait a certain time period, you're released. And if you go to dig and you do hit something and they didn't mark it, that contractor who didn't come out to mark it, and I'm not talking about the contractor maybe you hired, but the one who owns the line didn't mark it, they're held liable for it and they have to correct it. But you need that documentation and proof on your part to say, hey, I did my due diligence and please keep it. Don't ever get rid of it, because if they ever do come back and they indicate that something was hit on your side, trust me, you'll want it.
So something there with the 811. So they're going to come out, they're going to locate it was Verizon, Frontier Fios. Well, that's great. The reality is, though, they're not telling you how deep it is.
No.
They're just saying it's there.
Somewhere.
So we had an improvement done to our property. They came out and marked it. I dug down to find that it was about this far below the soil. So before my contractor came, not everybody can do this, I literally dug the line out and marked it with yellow flags, said don't dig here. But that was a lot of extra work on my part because I didn't want my cable to be cut. Guess what? It still got cut. But when I called Frontier, they came out and they wanted to, oh, well, you didn't do this right, and you cut it, and now I'm going to charge you $400. I had taken pictures, I had documented when they were there, and I did the depth thing, and after I showed them all this stuff, they weren't so hot on billing me for $400.
So when Verizon came in 15 years ago, whenever, they had to coordinate with the city to put in that utility. And did the city mandate one of the requirements that it be buried at a certain depth?
So that's actually not, so it's not necessarily dictated by us. That's actually done at a different level, and it's not by us. So let me give you an example of that. So we actually do still have installations in main branches that are replaced or new installs that are done. And when we get those, they apply for those, and I actually take those in along with the plans. And they have to adhere to what those specs are. They actually have to submit those with the utility company. Once we get those, we make sure that we look at those plans and make sure that the traffic patterns are in place, where they're going to actually dig at, and we keep all that on file. Now, I can't say anything prior to me, but I know that I keep a copy of everything that I've had in the last 3 years in our new system, and I make sure that we have that. So if anything does happen, we actually have the stated plans that indicate how deep those are supposed to be. There are depths that they are supposed to adhere to. Texas 811 actually tracks that on their site. It'll tell you. So for instance, it'll tell you color coding too, and I'll give you an example of that. So orange is for all telecom use. Doesn't matter who the franchise is. If you see an orange painted line, it's because it's for telecom. White's for construction, blue's for water. Nowadays, green used to be for sanitary, but purple is being used more and more, and that's generally an indicator. And then yellow for gas, red for electric. So, and it actually lists all that on there, and it tells you the required depths of those lines. If you ever want to go on Texas 811, I advise you, go on there and look. It has a lot of really good information on there. In the case that they hit it, you can go, I'm telling you, what Pat said is actually true. Take a picture before. I have a lot of contractors, they love me to death. Because I'll show up on site and they'll ask me all the time, well, I'm gonna go ahead and just do this, I'm gonna do this culvert, so I'm just going to dig it out. I just applied for the permit. We hadn't approved it yet, and they'll be out there digging. I'll stop them, I'll red tag them. I tell them, you're not cleared until I actually pull the permit and have you call Texas 811. And then next thing you know, you get a buried drop that's hit, and I've actually had that a couple of times. And so that's the reason for it. You're supposed to call Texas 811 prior. Even the contractor that we hired to do the roads, that was awarded the contract, has to call Texas 811, and they have to provide me the tickets and the documentation that they called before. Because even when a utility company comes in and they said that they buried it at a certain depth, if we're doing full depth repair, it could still be right there, and it could be very shallow because the depth of the road has changed during that process. And like he said earlier, it's not like every 5 to 10 feet. I actually used to do that work for the utility locates. We don't go out there and we don't mark it down and go, hey, by the way, it's 5 foot in this area and 10 foot in there. They don't do that. That's not how it works. They're not required to either. They're just required to indicate that there is actually something there. And it has to be within so many feet of the markings, because there is a little bit of play whenever they're actually marking it. So I just wanted to, I kind of went off on a tangent on that, but anyways.
Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that Vickery, we're getting a lot of drainage from Vickery. Is there a way of making them help with our drainage? I know their engineer said, oh no, this flow is only going to be, you know, it no more than it was naturally, but, you know, we see that it's more. And then looking ahead, what's going to happen when the area across from McMakin is developed? Doesn't that drain into our drainage area?
When they do that development, they'll have to take that into consideration. I haven't seen the plans yet, so I couldn't answer definitively what that will look
Pat just
like.
came from the meeting.
I just came from their meeting.
This is Pat Wellen, she's Deputy Mayor Pro Tem.
They had a meeting tonight on that, and I just came from that meeting, and that's one of my questions actually was on drainage and where it was going to drain. They say it's going to be down the middle of their property, but their engineer doesn't really know for sure.
Yeah.
But he assures us they're not going to go into the Timber Creek area, but he doesn't really know where that is for sure. So, more.
At least they know we're watching it.
Yes, we are watching.
We are monitoring that for a couple different reasons. Is if you see, you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's ever said they couldn't hear me. McMakin, Shiloh, and Kings Road, Denton County Trip 2022, which we are part of that bond package. They are now releasing funding for engineering for certain projects. One of the projects that they have released funding for is for that intersection. We do know for sure that intersection will be a roundabout. Shiloh, McMakin, and Kings will be a roundabout. Now, here's what's happening. That particular development, and maybe you saw something different tonight, Pat. They don't know if it's right where it's at today, or if it's going to go 100 yards to the west, but it's going to be in that area. And so we had a meeting with Tappan Associates, who is our town engineer, but is also an engineer that works on in many of the projects with Trip 2022. So the reality is that they're already thinking about that. And guess what's around the corner then in terms of thinking about next? Is that Kings Road. All right? Now, when they did Waketon Road, that was a part of the 2008 TRIP program for Denton County. When did we finish Waketon? Last year. Okay? So, what I'm saying is, it doesn't mean they're going to run out and do Kings Road the next 2 years.
No.
However, with so much development going on in Denton County, there are 48,000 parcels of property under review for homes in Denton County on the docket right now. 48,000 parcels of property, and growing every week. So what's going to happen with Trip 2022 is they're going to come around and they're going to start packaging this project and this project equals this project. We're going to get some funding. Now I want to stress that Kings Road, we would have the option to not take part in Trip 2022. Prior mayors, not named Donnelly, committed $500,000 to Denton County. We did Waketon for $100,000. So that's already a little bit of a sore point for the town, is that a commitment was made and now we have to live with it. The estimated cost to do Kings Road will be somewhere between $5 and $6 million. Can this town afford to do Kings Road?
No.
No.
It's just that.
Did this town do Simmons Road? No. Denton County stepped in. Denton County paid for Waketon Road along with Flower Mound in our portion, which is $100,000. We had issues with some design work that was done on Waketon Road that an engineer made a wrong calculation that created $316,000 worth of change orders on the Double Oak side. We committed $100,000. They were ready to come back to Double Oak and say, you got to go $316,000. We went to Judge Eads in the county, they picked it up. They didn't have to, but they did. They've been a very good friend. Judge Eads has a soft spot in his heart for this town. What I'm saying is that when we sit down and start to consider Kings Road design, which by the way, is probably going to start happening right at the first of the year, I want to get ahead of this thing. I want to get a file built on what we think. We've already had a drainage or a Kings Road study done. We're going to get that. So we're going to move from drainage to Kings Road probably in the next 3 months because we need to get something documented, just in case. Just in case.
Why can't you just leave Kings Road alone?
We can. And believe me, we're going to have a lot of public hearings on that.
Yeah, because I mean, if you widen that thing, all those people, I don't need people going any faster in front of my house.
Those are all going to be taken into consideration. But here's one thing about Kings Road. I'll get to here in a second. Here's the thing about Kings Road is you see all of this. This is Kings Road. You see all these drainage things. You think all these drainage things that are built into this thing?
Seems like money could be used for that when they build the road, or at least.
So
or maybe we'll just do that for the road.
We are absolutely going to build every drainage pathway if we do Kings Road. If we do Kings Road, we will. I've already had the conversations with engineering. We're going to make sure we have every pipe that we need to move all the water in and through, and we could get it done and paid for by Denton County.
Well, so that was my question, but instead of actually widening or doing anything to Kings Road, couldn't you still say you're improving the road by making these drainage improvements too?
No, that is not the intent of the
No.
program. And when
How much wider are you going to make it?
That's up to us. We need to get together and figure out the type of design.
I know what you're coming my way.
So, like I said, that's what I'm saying.
Take the other side. Take the Flower Mound side.
We're going to start to move towards some public meetings on that. We're going to get organized. Deputy Mayor Pro Tem did a heck of a job collecting this information. We've got to disseminate it. I wasn't expecting to get the phone call when it said, hey, they're starting to release funding for engineering. I'm just saying, wow, that's a signal we should at least start to do something, even though it may not happen for 3 or 5 years. The original master plan for Denton County actually showed Kings Road, 4-lane, divided highway. No, I've got it. I can show it to you. It's hilarious. Someone got that somewhere when Kings Road popped up on the trip 2022, and I was inundated with emails and texts. Are we going to have a 4-lane divided highway on Kings Road?
Can't afford
No. That was a master plan from a long time ago. Today, we have control of what we want from Kings Road. What's going to happen why we need to get started on it now is that if we don't, and then all of a sudden Dane County goes, let's do Kings Road, their engineers are going to take over and design it the way they want it. We still have input. We had it, the town, talking with Mayor Donovan, we had a lot of input on Waketon Road. A ton of it. We got to do the same thing with Kings Road. And we can still go all the way up to the end and say, you know what, we don't want to do this. All right? Now, I'm only going to preface this by saying Judge Eads is taking care of the town. Judge Eads has a priority list of things he wants to get done in Denton County. And one of those things is McMakin Road as a north-south throughway. And Bartonville's not in Trip 2022 because of a bad situation I'm not going to go into that we were a part of, and they backed out. It's all been settled. We've made friends with Bartonville after this. The commitments were made on our part that they should never have been made. They jumped out. Judge Eads is trying to get Bartonville to come back in. All right. Regardless of that, the development's happening. What is it called, Pat?
It's called Eden Ranch.
Eden Ranch is going to happen. In that corner of Shiloh, McMakin, and Kings Road is gonna be one of the first improvements done to that. We don't know if they're gonna do 4-lane road south, that means that whole Shiloh is gonna have to shift to the west. If they stay 2-lane, it may stay there. My guess is, and still don't know this, is it's gonna shift to the west. But either way, Kings is gonna be in a roundabout. So, this is about drainage tonight, but I'm sharing this with you because you'll probably see us come back to the town and let's start to get input on what Kings Road could be. And let's get it at least organized, put in a file, so the next mayor, the next council, or the mayors in 10 years, and councils in 10 years can go back and pull something out and say, this is what we like. If we just wait, it's gonna be forced upon us, and we don't wanna do that, so.
I'll also echo onto that. So Flower Mound has actually had prior conversations with us, which we opted not to go with because we had no facilitation of money, and really, it's really on their side of improvements. But Bridalwood has an area which you were prefacing towards earlier on Flower Mound side. So just everybody understands where Kings turns into Kings going east to west, and where it goes past our fire department. When you meet that corner and you run into Bridalwood, that area right there, all the way down until you get towards Lusk, that's Flower Mound side of the road. I get called all the time for maintenance on it, and I usually have to call them, and then I have to call the people at Bridalwood, but that's actually Flower Mound. Flower Mound has asked us to sit down and have a conversation regarding the Trip 2022 improvements as to drainage updates, because they do get a lot of flooding on that side. I'll also indicate that the golf course that actually exists over there that actually has water, that's the tail end of the water. They receive water in there. So anytime the Timber Creek overflows, it actually swells up into that side to the point where it reaches full capacity, and then all of it just sits pretty heavily. It continues to move out, and it moves towards the west, not to the east. Everything's moving towards the west. So that's one reason that Kings Road has had infrastructure issues for a very, very long time. And then you see them clear out Lusk all the time. They go try to make improvements down there, and they've got 3 huge culverts that are underneath the road there. I've actually walked down in it before to take a look at it because it was eroding, and they actually went in there and put some riprap and made some improvements there to try to help facilitate some of the drainage. They're wanting to fix the drainage on that other side of the road, and they're asking us to at least open up conversation for the improvements as a joint effort to alleviate water in the area coming from Double O towards that side. And they've introduced several different plans. They talked about as far as going and introducing another pipe, because there's actually a culvert, a really large culvert, that they actually pay to have someone in diving equipment go to the golf course, swim all the way up the culvert pipe because it's large enough, and make sure that it's free of debris from time to time. They actually do that. I didn't know that, and then I found out and I was blown away. And then they've also talked about open inlet moving water, so basically putting an open drainage ditch on the other side of moving water. And then they've also come up with a concept design that they talked about putting all pipes underneath ground as wide as Kings Road is, and putting it underneath Kings Road when moving the water. I say all that to say this is one of those opportunities when we talk to when we're talking to Denton County to look at how we can move the water in an effective way with engineers, with the alleviation of those costs, utilizing their engineers and then our engineers at a disc. I want to say this, it's not necessarily a discounted rate, but I'm going to say it for just all intents and purposes, at a discounted rate to find out what improvements need to be made to move water as it's moving across the road, but also not to the point where it's impacting the homeowners on the other side. There are things that can be done to slow water moving through as it comes to the other side. And so the engineers would also be a part of that process. We would like to entertain that if we get down to that point. So just know that even Flower Mound is talking about this exact same thing. They've actually asked us. I've had conversations with them previously when I first came on, and we were like, yeah, no, we can't afford to do any of that. It was a very, very expensive. But now that we're talking about the Denton improvement for the Trip 2022, there is some possibility of entertaining those ideas and seeing what that looks like. We're not committing to anything. At least we're just at least having a discussion to find out what that looks like. Because when you tear out the road, the best time to get the drainage taken care of is when you're ripping out the road, because at that point you save costs on that money while you're actually there and you're actually getting to look at what the soil drainage is like and everything else, because you're already paying for the engineer study at that point. You might as well just have them do it while you're there. So anyways, any other questions?
real quick. Lady back here in the white had her hand up. I'll make sure she gets it.
Yes, ma'am. I'm so
Oh.
sorry.
It's okay, I was actually just being sarcastic. I was wondering why we
Of
can't,
holding your hands up, because I'm just
Well,
trying to ignore you.
Eden, that whole Eden Ranch, I'm making, that's all gonna be a gated community. We're not gonna be allowed in there. So why can't we make Double Oak a gated community? I mean, I don't understand.
So while we're being funny about that, let me tell you something about how the gated community thing works. Once you stick up gates, you own the roads. So if you want to, yes.
Well, you know
So,
what? Double Oak might be able to come up with the money to fix Kings if we could keep all of them off of it.
yeah, I hear you on that. That's a really good point. I just wanted to preface with that. I know we're having fun and giggles about that because I actually lived in a community, they wanted to gate it until they found out, oh, by the way, you're going to own those roads and you've got to pay for that concrete work every time it messed up. And they go, yeah, you know what? Fort Worth is great. They can continue to maintain it. And we'll just go ahead and maintain the green space. And so, anyways.
Well, the Flower Mound side, I don't know, you tell me, it seems like it was at least more modern than what we have, right? So on the Flower Mound side of Kings Road, I've seen that they have a huge, I don't know, open culvert. It's a concrete drainage ditch, pretty wide. And our fire department guys have to go over on our side of Kings Road when it floods because they have a tiny little culvert with a big grate in front of it, and there's all kinds of logs jammed in there, and that's why the water's going over Kings Road in the first place. Once it gets across the road, they have this huge concrete ditch that turns 90 degrees and goes down towards the golf course. So I guess I'm asking, are they, I mean, they seem like they're prepared for a high level of water. We seem like to be the ones that's got the small pipe on the other side that can't get it to them.
So that sounds great in theory.
Okay.
That's the people on Rangewood Drive.
Yeah.
They're this area right here floods every time it rains.
Okay.
And under what we've had under our spring conditions, it's gotten as bad as it reaches almost near the top of their fences in some cases.
So even though it's wide and it looks nice and concrete.
We lived on that culvert for 10 years before we moved to Double Oak, and there was barely ever water in it for 10 years. It hardly ever had water in it, even when there was big water.
That's what I was saying. It seems like they have more than adequate. But
Yeah.
It's built to move a lot. There's
Well,
nothing
and
that gets in it.
speaking of debris, let me state this because we talk about that a lot, and then it becomes, well, do we have an ordinance? And we were talking about ordinances earlier. If you go onto the Town of Double Oaks website and look for stormwater management plan, we actually have one that is done every 5 years. A study is done, and then research goes out pertaining to that. Within the confines of that information, and if you like reading and you're looking for some delightful reading to go to bed, it actually talks about maintenance requirements and things that you need to do to maintain your property. It talks about things like picking up your leaves after the fall, under rain events that could clog after debris hits it. And I'll say this, Twin Lakes knows all about this because I was actually blown away, just to show you how much water can do damage. So one of the homeowners has the ornamental metal fence that crosses through there. And I passed by before the rain event and after the rain event, it split it open like a tin can. It split it wide open. And all it took was one branch and then a bunch of leaves after that just ramrodding against it, and then it just built a dam and it blew it wide open. And it ripped the fence open. If water wants to get somewhere, it's going to get there.
Mother Nature wins.
Yeah, that'll do too.
And it's only like 6 inches high as far as the depth goes. But all that debris, the logs come out of there, and then the concrete rolls over, and he's putting sluice gates in now, which is the best thing you could ever do there.
And the thing is that we have, and I say all that to say that as homeowners and as property owners, everyone has a responsibility to maintain their property. Right. When you don't pick up your leaves and you have 100 oak trees on your property, I know it's nice to have shade and, it's going to keep the ground and your grass is going to grow beautiful in the spring and everything else. And then we get a really heavy rainfall event and then your neighbor all of a sudden adopts all of your landscape. Yeah. And so you have to be cognizant of that and try to do your best diligence on your part. And that also is prefaced with this. I've seen fences abutted the ground. And when we do permits, I can tell you, since I've been here, whenever someone installs a fence, you're not allowed to abut it to the ground. You cannot block the water flow with your fence to stop your neighbor's water from coming onto your property because you're tired of the water coming over there. It's intended to go there for a reason, or the drainage area needs to be looked at. Don't abut your fence or stick up a retaining wall with no drainage that effectively moves the water. I've seen drainage utility easements get improved with that stuff, where it was done pre-existing to me, but it blocks water out. It's not intended to do that. You can't just develop whatever you want there and barricade the water from your neighbor, and the next thing you know, your neighbor gets a nice swimming pool in their property every time the rain event comes. You have to do it effectively. That's one reason we were talking about drainage utility easements earlier. And even if it doesn't indicate it and the water is cutting through there, you need to at least take that into consideration when you're making those developments. So I just wanted to indicate that, which is one of the reasons we need ordinances that are a little bit stronger. Any other questions? Okay.
So, we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up here, but I want to preface to say we've still got about 20 minutes. And there might be some discussion that you would like to have at the map. Obviously, it's not a huge map. But Chris, Randall, we're all Scott, Randall, and myself will be here. We will have to have you out of here by about 9:05. But I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. We talked about a lot of things, and there's some recommendations, and we're going to be putting together an outline of all of the things that came up tonight. So, for example, no particular order, FEMA floodplain claims, the data, a 2,500-year event in terms of our contour map of the town, SWMP that Randall just referred to. We'll make sure we get that document and put it into the trove of documents we're going to list on this, so you don't have to go looking for it. But I'm going to ask you this too, and this is something we didn't really get into a lot. We have a real, with about a 96% probability that we know where every cross culvert is in Double Oak, on every road. There's about a 4% that we don't know. For example, we had a citizen that called and said, hey, I noticed that water goes down into my grass, and I don't know where it goes. And then you look across the way, and water is coming up in the grass, but yet you could not walk up there on a dry day and know there was a cross culvert underneath there. If this is occurring on your property or on one of your neighbor's properties, would you please email the town with your address and say, I've got a cross culvert at this address that's going from this on across the road. We want to come out, identify it, and mark it. We are going to go out and study every cross culvert in this town, because that's an area that we know the town can and must budget for to improve. How many we can do in a year and where we can do it, all that needs to be still put under consideration. So if you know of cross, and even if you think that we might know it, go ahead and let us know. We want to get all these identified. Some of them are just hidden over the years.
The map that was in the study that showed.
Had 25 of them.
Was that from what half did, or was that?
That was half.
Okay, so it's not complete.
It is not.
It's not complete.
No.
Okay.
So if you know them, I referenced Kings Road. I want to preface. Kings Road will happen. The town is a part of TRIP 2022, but the town also has the option not to be a part of it. So we do want to start talking about it and working on what we think it should look like, it could look like.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
that East Kings Road, the one that it goes up to the town hall?
Yeah.
That section, is that what he was saying, is not included, that's
No,
environmental?
all of Kings Road is
So
included.
that side?
We own Kings Road.
When you say Kings Road, that goes through?
All the way up to Waketon.
Okay.
Yes.
Real quick, where do you want us to send the information about the cross culverts? We have two of them near our house I know about, I'll just let you know where they are.
So you can send it to permits.
So send it to permits@doubleoak.texas
Okay.
spelled out .gov. I say that because I deal with a lot of people in permitting, and they always want to put TX, and I'm like, no, Texas spelled out all the way out. So you can send it to that. If they're highly visible, we identify those ones. But if it's like something that you believe that it's not visible, or it's one of those, I had someone actually come in the last meeting and said there's a 6-inch pipe that goes underneath the road that he thinks someone else installed, and he actually let me know, and I didn't even know that existed. It was buried. And so, yeah, definitely let us know about that. I know that there are some that may even have crushed pipes And if the grass is growing over it and we don't know about it, definitely let us know about that as well. Because we do need to add that into our agenda as far as what it is that we have in the list that we're compiling regarding those. So,
Permits at
permits@doubleoak.texas.gov. We love dots. I don't know if you know that or not.
Is there a way to let the homeowners know that they have issues? I mean, some people haven't even looked at their culverts, or they don't even know that their ditch is sediment, or it was a ditch at one time. Is there, I mean, without being, browbeating, and here's a new ordinance, you need to do this, or the HOA comes in and says, you're gonna be fined if you don't do this. It seems like some people would probably fix it on their own if they even knew that, like, do you realize your culvert's halfway full of dirt? Is there a way to do that without making your job harder, Randall?
No.
No.
Not necessarily, I wouldn't say that it makes it harder. A lot of questions come up whenever you're talking about it, because you're talking about a lot of information that transpires regarding information going back and forth.
Right.
And I love that dialogue, because then the information sometimes a homeowner will tell me doesn't necessarily get extrapolated from the information we actually have within our archives. And so a homeowner knows more about their property than I do.
Right.
For example, like the Thornhill Estates, and when they actually put the culvert across the whole entire property with inlet drains, I didn't know that. The homeowner told me about it in passing conversation when I was talking about drainage. I went back and I found the permit, and then I found out that they actually did make improvements and it was installed. So yes and no, but I know that one thing that's going to help with that, to facilitate what you're talking about, is when the ordinance is going to place. It's not necessarily saying, hey, we need to go out and necessarily enforce it, but when the town becomes more knowledgeable about that and it gets pushed out more and more, and honestly, y'all are our biggest voices. So I can say so much and I can only visit so many of you. But when everyone's talking to their neighbors and passing about, hey, did you know that they actually did this study? Not saying go to your neighbor and browbeat them about changing it, right? So I'm not saying do that, but just information sharing. I can tell you this, every homeowner has been hand-placed this drainage plan meetings on their doors.
Right.
So if they didn't know it, I would hope that they would know it by now. And we may do something very similar if an ordinance comes into place and there's changes. Yeah, so we will.
Well, couldn't we at least find the high points? Like, he's identified these polygons. Couldn't we find some of the major culverts that would impact more than just one person's property, and the committee go and try to identify some of those high impact areas that we could maybe let those people know?
I can tell you, well, I'll say this. We can identify everything in the, and I'm over exaggerating, but we can identify everything in the world. It's just gonna take a lot of money. So when we prioritize this, we did a high level overview to identify things that were most impacted at this time. We can add to it, of course, but that costs money, and half doesn't do anything for free. Did y'all change anything recently?
No, I'm just saying he's already done some of that.
Yeah,
right?
he has, but some mapping does cost us. I'm not saying that the town doesn't want to spend money to do it.
No.
I'm just letting you know that everything has a dollar amount attached to it. Okay.
All right. I'm reading.
So the best part about gathering this information and having the notes from these 3 sessions, soon to be 4 next week, will be the fact that we are then going to go sit down with the drainage committee and start talking about this.
Okay.
All right, I do want to preface the fact there is no ordinance in place at this time. Your input will be a part of that. When or if we do move towards an ordinance, we will have public meetings. All right? We will have public, and this will be sooner than later. Okay? There's a lot of stuff going on in the town. The good news is that it's all what we feel is for the betterment of the town. And so this council is committed to me as mayor, that if we're going to do something or we're going to start something, you're going to hear about it, you're going to be invited to it, and you're going to have an input in it. Doesn't mean at the end everybody's going to like the outcome. But it will be discussed in this town, and we will make sure that we communicate. So if we don't have your email addresses, let's make sure we get them. If you don't subscribe to our email blast that we have every Friday, go on to our website and sign up for that. All right? We try and hit the email updates at the same time we blast the town, but that doesn't mean we're reaching everybody. In the instance of these drainage meetings, we literally hand deliver to everyone, every single door, to ensure that everyone got one of these. So Randall did a heck of a job. I helped him for a little bit, but Randall was way faster than I was, and he could get more places. So I do want to thank you for that, Randall. Very much appreciated. Last couple of things. I just referenced the ordinance. The other thing, too, yes.
Don't forget to tell them about the form that they can fill out their own individual problems that they're having.
Scott, could you hold that up, please? So take one of these, and if you have an issue with it, write it up, drop it by the town hall, scan it, email it. Even if you email it to the permit thing, this will help us. As far as all these culverts in town, I will guarantee you when you drive through Double Oak now, you're going to be looking down at the ditches, and you're going to look at that guy's is crushed, and he should be doing something about it. When you drive across Timbers, just drive across Timbers, and you just look at all of the different time. This one was done in the 60s, this was done, or not the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and you can tell. And so to answer your question, Nathan, there's 1,225 parcels of property that are on the tax rolls in Double Oak. Somehow, some way, if we could get a picture of 1,225 culverts that are going underneath driveways, and keep in mind some driveways have two, that would go a long way to figuring that out. And so I don't know if we can do that, we'll figure out a way to. It's the Drainage Committee, we'll be talking about that as well. Last thing, I want it to be clear. Double Oak does not have a stormwater usage fee. And if we decided to attempt to go there, just like the ordinances, it will come in front of the town and it will be discussed. When Lake Dallas, they put this in Lake Dallas, I'm president of a business that was located there, and we started getting this bill for $516. I'm like, what is this? I go up to town hall, say, hey, we're Comco Systems, blah, blah, blah. I've got 6 acres over here. Why are you billing me $500 on my water statement? Well, that is the stormwater usage fee. I said, what is that? Well, we're charging you to have water fall on your land and run off into our streets, and we carry it away. I said, you gotta be kidding me. Point is this is happening a lot in many municipalities, as Scott had said. It is a way that we could build a quicker fund to help some of these drainage issues. Not saying we're going to, it's better that you hear it now, that it could, but we will be completely transparent. This council, this mayor will be completely transparent on if we decided to go to something, we will let you know ahead of time so we can get your voice. All right? And again, it doesn't always mean we get everything we want, but we will let you know. So I appreciate everybody being out here tonight. Thank you. We understand that this is always going to be ongoing. Yes.
I have a quick, hopefully yes or no answer or question. On page 89 in the packet, it lists 11 capital improvement projects to be done over the next 5 years. Is this already in the budget, already planned?
No, that was from 2007.
Gotcha. So these are the
that was
old things.
What we did is we compared the 2007 with the 2024. That was just a comparison. And I think they only did 1 or 2 of those. Because believe it or not, 3 projects from that showed up in here. So, like I said, we've got until about 9:05 to take a look at the map, ask some questions. Thank you very much. We appreciate you all. Have a great evening.
You're so tired. Where are you at?
That's what I'm saying. There's some properties on the poor guys.
Hey, Randall.
Yes, ma'am.
You're a good time now.